on the ground in Ukraine against the Russians, and knowing Petraeus as I know you do, I'm sure you know that he wouldn't have said something like that without having run it up the flagpole first. So first, what do you think militarily of what General Petraeus has offered? And secondly, who, since he's a civilian now, up the flagpole would he have run this past? Who else wants this? Does the Secretary of State actually expect his boss, the President of the United States, whose administration is tottering on the brink and whose physical existence is tottering on the brink, to put American troops on the ground? I'm asking you a lot all at once. I'll let you take those balls and run with them.
Well, on the first question, I think we have to regard this as having been a kind of trial balloon. In other words, Petraeus was given this material and told to run with it because the people in Washington are interested to see or hear what kind of a response, if any, they get from the American people. That's the first thing. Secondly, unfortunately, I do think there is serious planning going on about the use of U.S. forces in Ukraine. I think it's very dangerous. I think it's ill-conceived, but it's going on. Third, the mention of a coalition of the willing is a dead giveaway because NATO is not united on this issue. Most people in Europe are not interested in being dragged into a war with Russia. So when you ask the question, what is this coalition of the willing? Well, are we going to get some Romanian troops, Polish troops, perhaps, maybe some Lithuanians? It's hard to tell. Anybody else prepared to show up? I don't know how many British troops they can expect to get. I don't think the British could field 10 to 15,000 troops in any period of time that would be competent on the battlefield. The French, they're already overextended in Africa. So I don't know who else we're talking about. So this coalition of the willing, as it's termed, is another indicator. And then finally, why are we talking about this at all, Judge?
Right. Why? Because the globalists in the State Department want to put Putin out of business, and they think they can do it.
First, it's because Ukraine is devastated. It's losing. It's on the brink of extinction. The counterattacks that we saw over the last several months, it started out with 30, 40, 50,000 troops, then declined to perhaps 10,000, 12,000. They declined further to 3,000 to 5,000. And recently we've seen battalion-sized units, 500, 600, 700, actually trying to probe and walk through Russian defenses. They're running out of manpower that can fight. And in fact, the information I have is that the Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform, and we don't know how many there are. I've heard lots of estimates all the way up to and a little bit above 10,000. And then the so-called Foreign Legion that Ukraine has fielded, which may number 5,000 to 7,000 or less. Again, we don't know. That those formations are the only formations with any stomach for a serious attack in a major fight. So that's the other point. Now, finally, to go to yours. Yes, Judge, we have people in Washington who want a direct confrontation with Russia because they believe they can bully Russia. They believe they can compel the Russians to submit, that Mr. Zelensky can show up and accept their surrender. It's bizarre. There's no evidence for it. It's dangerous. It's stupid. But yes, they are there. And I think that characterizes the thinking at the top of the administration.
So Zelensky, who was all over the place in the media for 7 or 8 months, really hasn't made, two observations, hasn't made very many public appearances in the past month. So I offer to you the thought that maybe he knows that what you're saying is truthful and his days are numbered. The other observation I want to make is the storied American 101st Airborne is in Europe for the first time since World War II. They're in Romania. What are they doing in Romania?
Well, according to the reports, there are about 5,000 of them. This is a mix of light infantry and UH-60 aircraft. I don't know if they have a battalion of H-64D attack helicopters with them, but they're supposedly working with Romanian forces. Again, this this looks like one wing or one leg of the coalition of the willing. Then the rest of the division is up in Poland, which is several hundred miles north. And there are all sorts of rumors on the internet, and people are saying, oh, well, they're going to fly in to Odessa and set up a blocking position to prevent the Russians from moving on Odessa. And they'll be reinforced. Okay, I find it hard to believe that we would be quite that stupid, because Odessa is very definitely on the menu for the Russians. It's a Russian city, a Russian-speaking city. It's never been Ukrainian. And they are going to retake it, just as they're going to retake Kharkov for the same reasons. And that's probably where they would stop normally. But if this happens, I don't think the outcome will be a positive one for the United States and its coalition of the willing. And then, of course, the question is, if we sustain heavy casualties and we are seen as losing, are we then going to turn to nuclear weapons? Because as I've said repeatedly on this thing, I have never seen any interest on the Russian side in the use of a nuclear weapon. I've seen nothing to indicate it. The statements that have been made were always made in response to us, response to anyone who questioned whether the Russians would respond if they were attacked with a nuclear weapon. And they made it very clear that they will. And this is the problem with this limited nuclear war business. But I think now the danger is we could walk into this. And as I tried to point out in that short 1,000-word op-ed, we're not ready. This is sort of get set and go in whether you're ready or not. And we're not ready. The infrastructure isn't there. The tons of ammunition are not on hand. The force sizes don't make any sense. I mean, we keep saying, well, the Russians were stupid when they went in, they made all these mistakes. Well, the Russians at least went in there with a goal of not killing fellow Orthodox Slavs. That was a goal. Didn't want to kill them. All right, that didn't quite work out as they'd hoped. But now we're talking about going in, and we have no such guidelines or constraints, but we don't have the forces. And we're now saying, well, the Russians are building forces. Well, there's a reason for that. This place is the size of Texas. If you don't have several 100,000 troops, you're not going to be able to dominate it. How are we going to do this? I think it's insane.
Something else that you alluded to in your fascinating 1,000-word op-ed to which you just made reference was the War Powers Resolution. In my view, a profoundly unconstitutional piece of legislation, but it's never been tested in the courts. And it means that we could all wake up some morning to find Joe Biden on television saying, by the way, last night, 50,000 American troops entered the fray in the Ukraine war, and there's nothing the Congress or anybody could do about it for 90 days. Then he reports on it, and they can stay another 90 days. Then he needs congressional approval. But for half a year, for 180 days, he has, in my view, the constitutional power that Madison and company expressly reserved for the Congress in his own hands. He can choose the target and wage the war, which makes him a prince. Madison was adamant about separating war-making power from war-waging power, but this terrible piece of legislation, which President Nixon vetoed because he thought it crimped his style rather than expanding his power, another argument for another time, gives Joe Biden that authority. Is this something we have to fear, that we wake up some morning and find out that while we all slept, 50,000 uniformed American troops, I'm just throwing that number out, entered the Ukraine-Russian war?
Yes. I think it's a real possibility now, much more so than any kind of nuclear exchange. I still do not believe that anyone in the White House is deranged enough to even consider such a thing. But I do think that this is a possibility. How much is it? 90%, 80%, 60%? I don't know. But I do know that after I'd written that op-ed piece, I received an awful lot of information from people on the inside telling me that I was dead right and on target, and then beginning to tell me the kinds of things that were under consideration. So yes, I think it's a possibility. Now, if we go back to this whole business, let's face it, certainly since FDR, I think we've lived in a world of presidential government. And that's
Yes.
one of the tragedies of the United States. We were founded as
Agreed.
and,
Agreed. There's
and
there's no
Nixon.
question about that the presidency, no matter who occupies it, whether it's Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan, or Harry Truman or Barack Obama, the presidency has expanded almost to the point of dictatorial powers. That George W. Bush and his successors all claim that somehow they can kill people. I mean, these
Right.
are claims that even to FDR would have sounded alien. But I have heard nothing other than from you and our colleagues who've been critical of General Petraeus from his statement. Now, you say it may have been a trial balloon. Were they expecting tub thumping in support of it, or were they expecting silence because no one wants to be the first one behind Petraeus to say it's time to put American troops in harm's way?
I think they're most interested to see if there is any public reaction. The people that govern in Washington are really accustomed to a quiescent, compliant public. I mean, how often do people take to the streets to object to things that we do overseas with the American military? The last time I remember any serious opposition to anything being done overseas was during the Vietnam War. And people say, well, see, that's because we had a draft. Not really. It took years before they finally went to the streets and objected to the Vietnam War. How long were we in Vietnam before anything happened? 3 years. Right. So the problem is that most Americans on any given day aren't interested. And so what you get as a consequence of this is what you have now. Right now, we have people at the top of this administration who are behaving like 3-year-old children who have found out that there are these things called electrical sockets, and they've got forks, and they're shoving forks into the electrical socket to see what happens. Well, one of them is going to be electrocuted, to be sure. Probably will be shocked by it at the least. That's where we are. That's what this idea of going into Ukraine is. It's dangerously stupid. You are pushing the fork into the electrical outlet.
Let's get back to the status of things on the ground. One of our viewers asks, isn't it true that Russia has lost territory? And if so, why? That is, lost territory that it had previously conquered and acquired.
Well, the only place that they have lost territory, as I understand it, that is significant in terms of square mileage was up near Kharkov. And that was an area where they only had 2,000 paramilitary police stiffened by some paratroopers. And they just said, look, this is wide open, flat terrain. It's not worth it. We can come back here whenever we want to. And they pulled out. The Ukrainians were then subject to punishing artillery, rocket fire, missiles, airstrikes, and lost 40% of the force that went in there. Now, over the last several weeks, we've had these little maneuvers, little attacks that for a while pushed forward, were then driven back. And what has been going on just within the last 24 hours is another one of those. But the real focus has been Kherson, which is critical to the Russians and critical to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have been expending every effort they can to try and gain control of it. They haven't. And they haven't driven the Russians off the bridgehead that they have west of the Dnieper River. And I keep hearing people report that. So I always go back and check. And what we have seen is Russian civilians were understandably evacuated. That's a good thing. We don't want them to be killed, just as the Ukrainians ought to evacuate Ukrainian civilians to avoid their deaths. But there has been no massive withdrawal of Russian forces anywhere. And I would simply suggest that these modest gains here or there have generally been reversed. And if they haven't been reversed, it's because there's no urgency to do so. And remember, behind these front lines right now, most Americans don't know this, there are groups of Russian forces with the best equipment available of between 50 and 80,000 men training behind these lines down in southern Ukraine, also behind the lines up in western Russia or eastern Ukraine, and then up in Belarus. So it looks like we see the evidence for 3 major axes as a minimum emerging, involving hundreds of thousands of troops on the attack. That's their focus. They're not worried about a few kilometers here or there of open, flat terrain.
What is, if you know, what is life like in the formerly Ukrainian areas now under Russian control? Or, I mean, is this like when the Nazis entered Paris and somehow the SS was working with the Paris police, and somehow the SS found compliant French politicians to run the machinery of city government? So who runs government? Who runs the schools? And is there day-to-day normal life and commercial activities going on in these four regions that a year ago were subject to Kyiv and now are subject to Moscow?
Well, the areas that they're currently under Russian control have been given huge quantities of food, medicine, humanitarian assistance, which was badly needed. And there are large numbers of engineering organizations down there trying to rebuild many of the towns and villages and farms and so forth that were destroyed in the war. Since most of the people consider themselves to be Russian, I have not seen evidence for any friction, nor has any really been reported, and that includes reports by foreign journalists who are not Russians. So I don't think you can compare that with the Second World War. I mean, if we were talking about what was it like to be Polish, White Russian, or Ukrainian when the Soviet armies entered these countries as liberators, I can tell you from personal experience in large areas, people wanted the Germans to come back within 24 hours. So that's not what we're dealing with. This is a very different setting. And that's why reaching back to World War II all the time is a serious mistake. This is a very different set of circumstances. Beyond that, I can't report in any detail because I haven't been there.
How do you expect the winter will go? Next week is November, and soon heat will be a very serious problem, not just for the troops, but for people in their homes in Kyiv.
Well, unless Greta Thunberg can stop the onset of winter, I think it's going to be damn cold. And in that part of the world, having been in that part of the world, it's very cold in the winter. It's not.
Well, how about Berlin and Munich? How about major cities in Germany?
Well, of course, but those areas are going to get colder first. Remember, these are flat, open steppe, vast fields. So you don't have anything that holds in the heat. In other words, the cities are it. And most of the things that lie between the major cities are tiny villages and so forth. So there's nothing to hold the heat in. And the fuel is going to be a big problem for the Ukrainians. Right now, the Ukrainians are already withdrawing all of their armor because they don't have fuel for it. That is tanks and armored fighting vehicles. They're operating right now out of pickup trucks. That's what I referred to in the op-ed, the so-called technicals, where you put a heavy machine gun or an automatic cannon on a pickup truck. There's a reason for that. They don't have the fuel. The electrical grid is down, which means that the railways aren't working, except in those cases where the Ukrainians have diesel engines. The principal dead horse at the top of the menu is NATO, which continues to be treated as this sacrosanct holy relic. And frankly speaking, internally, it's in complete disarray. It's falling apart. And Americans, I think, sense it, and it's falling apart for all the obvious reasons. You've got economic problems in Europe compounded by all the sanctions imposed on Russia. And while our sanctions have no doubt had some impact, let's be frank, the blowback from the sanctions we've imposed on our European allies has been horrific. And now the Russians have simply announced that they will stop exporting any oil or gas to Germany until further notice. I think that's going to hit a lot of other Europeans. There are problems inside NATO. The Italians were trying to help the Germans with oil and gas, and they too are in a difficult position. And as a result, Draghi has been under severe criticism and is probably going to be forced out. Macron is always been on thin ice, and I think more so now than ever. The problem is that the European peoples are suffering. They're overwhelmed with the immigration problem. We've got 900,000 more Ukrainians pouring in on top of millions of Muslims. Criminality is out of control, and it's not being reported in the press, but the people that live there know what's happening. And there's a sense that why Russia? If you're an Italian or a German and you look at Russia, you say, well, wait a minute. I don't see Russia as evil incarnate, and it doesn't pose a threat to me. And of course, they're right.
So what does President Biden and what do the internationalists around him, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, and his colleagues in the foreign ministries in Europe, what do they really want NATO to do? I mean, do they want to see NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine or, God forbid, in Poland or Estonia fighting Russian troops because they see this as a means to either degrade the Russian military or get rid of Putin once and for all?
Well, very quick answer on the first one. No one in Europe is interested in committing its forces to a fight with the Russians. They don't see any reason for it. Most of what we call military establishments in Europe are gestures. They're facades. Most of these forces haven't seen any real action against anybody for decades, and they're certainly not up to taking on the Russian military. I mean, remember, the Russian military was this hopelessly inept, incompetent organization that has now withstood 150 days of continuous fighting and crushed the Ukrainian military establishment virtually out of existence, to the point where the Ukrainian government's going to have a tough time just surviving, especially if we stop funding it, which is what we're effectively doing. We've made Ukraine the 51st state. So, no, that first part is nobody wants anything to do with this war, and they know they're not prepared to fight it. As for the rest of it, I think they have went along with Biden's notion that somehow or another this would force Mr. Putin to resign and create a catastrophe in Russia. And they believed it. And now they've gotten an education. Russia has an abundance of resources. It's probably the country in the world that is richest in resources. It's not going to go out of business. And Mr. Putin's popularity ratings are through the roof in Russia. All the Russians see him as defending Russia.
Does there come a time when the American government recognizes that the sanctions were a disaster, that they're hurting American business enterprises? They're not at all deterring Putin. All these Russian oligarchs' yachts that were seized, that was just for show. Yeah. Is there a time when Tony Blinken and company realized we're on the wrong track and we got to get out of this?
I think privately they recognize that they are very much on the wrong track. I think they are taking alarmist phone calls from everywhere, from Stockholm to Berlin to Rome, Paris, Madrid. So I think they know that. The problem is they have no plan B. There was never any serious thought given to this whole process. In other words, what was the objective to begin with? No one had a stated objective except to build up the Ukrainian military to not only present a threat to Russia, but to potentially recapture Crimea and harm the Russian military. Well, this is fanciful nonsense that never made any sense. So there is no plan B. So I think they're going to do what you would expect these ideologues to do, which is double down on what they're already doing and then hope against hope that they can outlast this. And I'm not sure that they can. I mean, my recommendation, frankly, is send Nancy Pelosi to Kiev and let her sort it out and just leave her there until it's fixed.
She's threatening to go to all places, to Taiwan. And of course, Beijing is not very happy about that. And they're threatening some severe response to that. We'll talk about Nancy later. Tell me about the actual war. I mean, you don't see it on television anymore. You don't even see it on the front pages of the New York Times. So a couple of questions. Are the Ukrainians holding any ground? Have they won back any ground from the Russians?
No.
Have they actually used American military hardware to attack Russian hardware that is already inside Ukraine? So they're part of Ukraine is bombing another part of Ukraine. And where does Zelensky stand in his stability as the head of the Ukrainian government?
Well, as you know, Zelensky now fired Bakhanov and several other people that were in charge of the security services.
Very senior people.
Yeah, it looks like, the last days of Pompeii. The volcano has erupted, and now he's looking for people to blame for the lava flows that are pouring through the streets. So I think that's part of the problem. I don't think Zelensky is really in charge of a great deal anymore. He's got a force out there. The nationalists are trying to control what's left of it. They're rounding up deserters and either shooting them or forcing them back into action. But the truth is the Ukrainian forces are defeated. They can't regain what's lost. Most of the Russian army has been withdrawn, Judge. I'm talking about the combat force. They have been resting and refitting for the last few weeks. And the fighting in Donbass, which was always the critical portion of this operation, because that's where the Ukrainian forces were located, has been done by Chechen forces, separatist forces that have taken heavy casualties, and mercenaries. Those are the ones backed by massive Russian artillery, regular army artillery, but the regular army combat force that we saw at the beginning, that's been resting and refitting. And I think they're preparing for a massive offensive to finish off this war once and for all. And again, Putin is not interested in crossing the Dnieper River and going into Western Ukraine. But I think he will roll up to the Dnieper to a certain point, and then I think he still wants to gain control of Kharkov and Odessa.
All right, but as you point out in your piece, Worshipping Dead Horses, Putin cannot tolerate a free and independent Ukraine, much less a Ukraine that's a member of NATO, because that's a permanent 24/7 threat to Moscow. Am I right?
Well,
have I grasped properly what you wrote in this piece?
Well, not completely. I mean, it can be free and independent as far as he's concerned. It cannot be a puppet of the West. It can't be a platform for attack against him.
Or if it's a member of NATO, he views it as a puppet for the West.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, privately, he's told many people he doesn't care if Ukraine's part of the European Union, could care less. His concern from the very beginning was this massive NATO-trained and equipped army funded largely by us. That's no longer in the picture. But what I'm concerned about, what many Europeans privately are concerned about, I know Berlin is very much so. And remember, Berlin is still the elephant in the room economically. And right next to Berlin is a somewhat smaller elephant called Italy. Both of these states are concerned that what will happen is that we will go back into Ukraine in a subversive way and try to continue to use the Ukrainian people and the rump Ukrainian state as an opportunity to attack and threaten Russia. That's what he doesn't want. And that's what Berlin and Rome don't want. No European wants that. That means literally in our lifetimes, perpetual war, to the point where finally Putin decides, I don't want to go there. I don't want a border with NATO. Remember, that's one of the things he doesn't want. He doesn't want a border with NATO. He's already got a small one way up north in Estonia. He doesn't want it. So if he can't live with the situation because we make it impossible, well, then, you're forcing his hand again. I think it's time for this to end, and I think the Russians are going to try to do that over the next 30 days.
What are U.S. intelligence, senior members of the intelligence community advising the president? If you know, are they telling him what they think he wants to hear? Or are they telling him what you've just described, that this is a lost cause, it's over with, you better get the hell out and get out now?
Judge, the thing for all of your viewers to keep in mind is that presidents always get the intelligence they want.
Even if it's not truthful.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because we've lost our sense of proportionality. If you think that you are invulnerable, invincible, and more powerful than everyone else, then you think you can afford to ignore things like the truth when it suits you. This has gotten us into a lot of trouble now, I think, with Russia, because Russia is not Iraq. Russia is not Afghanistan. It's not Libya. And we're talking now, I listened to the former Secretary of State Pompeo essentially describe the apocalypse, the unification of Russia, China, and Tehran into one iron alliance that we should then set out to crush. I mean, this is the sort of madness that is rampant in Washington, and it presupposes that we are more than we are. In other words, we are not the nation, Judge, as you know, that we were in 1991. Right. 30 years ago, we were a very different country than the country today. And there doesn't seem to be any willingness to admit that and figure out that we've got serious problems here that need our attention. By the way, that's true for Western Europe.
One of the problems that you point out in your piece, Worshipping Dead Horses, you sort of pivot from explaining the uselessness and weakness of NATO into serious problems with the American military, which have been visited upon it by the attitude of current leadership, the Biden administration, with respect to promoting people on the basis of race and gender who are not the most qualified, and establishing the sort of woke atmosphere in the military that people like you and I and people watching us today laugh at when we see happening on college campuses. Now you're telling me and telling your readers that this is happening in the U.S. military. Have they considered the long-term effect of this nonsense?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think they have, and I don't think they understand just how debilitating it is. On the one hand, you have a president who is more warlike, frankly, more aggressive, more bellicose than any president I can remember in my lifetime when he talks about Russia. Not China, but Russia.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
George W. was bellicose, but not with respect to Russia.
Never. Absolutely not. And the key thing here is that while we have all this bellicosity on one side, we're systematically devastating the armed forces on the other side.
How to tell us how the armed forces are being systematically devastated?
Well,
imagine American armed forces.
Imagine you have a group of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Doesn't matter, but I would think certainly soldiers and Marines. And you announce that the commander has been removed, and you have a new commander. Your new commander is Tiny Tim, with the ukulele in the flowered shirt and the long hair.
Right, this is crazy.
He has kind of a uniform on, but
this is crazy, Colonel.
Yeah, but that's essentially what you've got. And says, look, Tiny Tim is one of the finest people we've ever met. And by the way, he's transgender, but you've got to take showers with him because he deserves the opportunity to take showers with you, even though he's transgender. And he may not wear a skirt all the time, but he's wearing one today. You have to tolerate all of this. This is important, and this is what makes us free. This is what we're talking about with diversity. And then the other thing is, I'm sorry, you're not a woman, you're not black, you're something else. You may be white, you may be Asian, Northeast Asian. We're not interested in you. We don't care how well you have performed. We don't care how many years you've served. We don't care about your performance under fire in combat. We're interested in Sheila over here and moving her forward because we want a new force that is radically different from the one you're in.
All right. When the government, and I realize there's some metaphors and exaggerations in there, but it's largely a summary of what's been happening. When the government does that, does it think in the long term, we don't use a draft anymore. We really need volunteers. We need thousands of volunteers every year. And our base for volunteers are young, virile men who really don't care about woke and don't want wokeness imposed on them, whether the young men are white or black or Hispanic or brown or whatever they may be. My point is, does the Biden administration leadership in the Pentagon recognize that imposing wokeness on the military will have a catastrophic effect on recruiting in the long term?
I think they've already seen it. We're already confronting this catastrophic impact on recruiting. We can't recruit the people that we want. And their attitude is it doesn't make any difference. We'll just drop the standards. We'll start recruiting people that we normally never take into the armed forces, people that are far below the desired IQ levels, people that have criminal records, people that may have serious problems, drug problems or something else. This is already happening. So again, I think they view it as none of these things matter anymore. We live in the era of push-button warfare. Fire a missile. We're still the biggest, most powerful, richest country in the world. We can do pretty much as we want. And the important thing in the backs of their minds is that we're building a force that reflects our leftist ideology and values. And we're replacing the values that were historically motivating inside the armed forces with our new values.
One of my Viewers just text us who wants to die for Biden and Zelensky. It's just so appealing. I mean, no American wants to do that. Does Tony Blinken? Does Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, do they think American troops want to die either for wokeness or for Zelensky?
Lloyd Austin is a mystery to me. I've never met the man, and looking back on the years that he served, he certainly was an enormously. Let's put it this way: he benefited enormously from the system that we have in place, right. Affirmative action and other things, and yet he's turned on the institution and seems to be turning on the American people and the country with incredible hatred and distaste. It's hard for me to fathom and imagine. It's even more difficult for me to look at senior officers who stand around and act as though this is perfectly normal. And when you say, "What the hell are you doing?" their answer is, "Well, I've got orders." Wow. Orders to do what? Destroy the force?
Right.
Ruin morale? Destroy cohesion? Destroy discipline? We don't even have the authority today in the chain of command that we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago to take action when it's required.
What is the level of wokeness? It's hard for me to ask this with a straight face in the Russian army.
Yeah, that's a great question. The last time I looked at a recruiting video, I'd say about 0. Everybody there understands the Russian army exists to kill enemies of the Russian state. And all the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines understand that's their number one task. We go to where we're ordered and we defend the country and we kill the enemies of the state.
All right. We're now at the end of July. Where will we be by Labor Day in the war in Ukraine?
I'd be
still sending billions of dollars in cash and material there, or recognizing the folly of what we've done?
I'm glad you brought that up, because most Americans don't understand, Judge. If you look at this $40 billion package that we passed back in May, almost universally, right, only about half of that is for military assistance. It's still $20 billion, but it's enormous.
What's the other half?
Well, the other half it's unclear. It goes into aid and assistance that we would term nation building, support the Ukrainian state, humanitarian assistance,